There are no windows in this room. Not broken windows, not boarded windows, no windows at all. The room is deep inside a building on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and it has 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor, and nothing else. No light during the day, no air at any hour. The only way to tell if it is morning or night is to walk to the front of the building and look out the hallway toward the street. There are 6 people living in this room. This is not a slum in some far corner of the world. This is the most populous island in the United States. This is the city being built as the future of the Western world. And somewhere near the top of that future, towers are going up. Department stores, banks, electric street lamps, theaters. The Statue of Liberty went up in 1886, just across the water. Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. They came. What they found was this room. By 1890, the Lower East Side of Manhattan had become something that urban planners could not fully explain and had no language to describe. In the 10th ward alone, the census recorded up to 1,100 people per acre. Not per city block, per acre. A single acre is about the size of an American football field. Picture 1,100 people living on that land, stacked into 5-story buildings covering 90% of every lot, with no courtyards, no gaps between structures, and almost no sky. For comparison, the densest neighborhoods in Bombay at the same time reached 750 people per acre. Prague was 485, Paris 434, London 365. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was the most densely populated piece of land on the planet Earth. It was not a neighborhood anyone planned. It was the result of a calculation performed by landlords how many bodies could be fitted into a 25-foot wide lot and still technically be called housing. The answer, by 1890, was a lot. A tenement was typically 5 or 6 stories. The street-facing apartments had windows. Everything behind them did not. The front room had light and air. The back rooms had neither. The hallways were dark at noon. The stairwells were so narrow that 2 people carrying anything could barely pass. The people who lived here were not the poorest immigrants in the city. The truly destitute, who had nothing at all, slept in police station lodging houses or in doorways. The tenement residents were the working poor, garment workers, peddlers, pressmen, cigar rollers, bootblack operators, laundrywomen. People who had jobs and still could not afford a room with a window. Many of them were Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Russia and Eastern Europe. Others were Italian, Irish, German. Each block had its own dominant language, its own pushcart dialect, its own internal economy. What they shared was the darkness, the water pump in the yard, and the smell. The smell. 150,000 horses lived and worked in New York City in 1880, and the number kept rising through the decade. Every delivery, every trolley, every carriage, every cart moved on horsepower. Each horse produced between 15 and 30 pounds of manure per day. Do that math, and you arrive at somewhere between 2 and 4 million pounds of horse manure deposited on the streets of New York City every single day. When it rained, the streets turned to muck, thick brown soup that soaked through shoes and splashed onto trouser legs and covered the cobblestones in a uniform layer of filth. When it was dry, the manure desiccated and crumbled into fine dust that the wind picked up and drove through every open window and every open doorway and into every set of lungs on the Lower East Side. On top of that coal smoke from thousands of cooking stoves and heating furnaces, ammonia from the outhouses in the tenement yards, The smell of fish and rotting produce from the pushcart markets on Hester and Delancey and Orchard Street. The smell of uncollected garbage in the alleys, and underneath all of it, always, the smell of too many people in too little space. New Yorkers of the era called the Lower East Side downtown. Visitors from uptown described walking into it as walking into a wall of odor. Reformers who went in with notebooks came out pale. Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant who had lived in those same tenements himself before becoming a newspaper reporter, described the smell as something that hit you in the face like a fist. He would spend years trying to make people uptown understand what it was like. He would eventually run out of words. That is when he picked up a camera. The elevated train ran directly over the rooftops of the Lower East Side. The young Harmadli Nor Makimeon was already itching of Satsatate. The 2nd and 3rd Avenue L lines had been operating since the 1870s and 1880s, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers a day. From the tenements on those streets, you could lie in bed and watch the cars pass at window level, close enough to read the expressions on passengers' faces. Every few minutes, day and night, the iron structure vibrated the buildings to their foundations. Dishes rattled, plaster fell from ceilings. Babies screamed and then, after a while, stopped screaming because screaming at the trains was useless, and children learned fast what was useless. The constant noise was not simply an annoyance, it was a physical fact of life that could not be escaped. Men who worked the night shift and needed to sleep in the daytime could not sleep. Mothers who needed infants to nap could not manage it. The shaking loosened joinery in buildings already built too fast with cheap materials, and water came in through cracks that opened in the walls, and the cold came in after the water. Below the L, the streets were in permanent twilight. The iron superstructure blocked the light. What little sun reached the tenements on 2nd and 3rd Avenue came in at an angle, briefly, in summer. In winter, for the inside rooms, there was no direct sunlight at all between October and March. The question that the tenement reformers kept asking was, how do these people survive? The answer was that many of them did not, and the ones who did survived by becoming machines calibrated to the production of a few cents per hour. The sweatshop system worked like this. A garment manufacturer would contract out work to a sweater, a middleman, usually an immigrant himself, who rented a tenement apartment and subcontracted the sewing to the people living in the same building. The workers, often entire families including children, would sit at their machines or hand sew for 12 to 16 hours a day. The room was also their kitchen and their bedroom. The light was a single kerosene lamp. The ventilation was whatever came through the gap under the door. In 1890, Jacob Riis photographed a room on Ludlow Street where men were making knee pants at 45 cents per dozen pairs. To earn $1, a worker had to produce more than 2 dozen pairs of pants. Working a full day without stopping, the most skilled operators might manage 3 dozen. That was $1.35 for 16 hours of work, bent over a machine in a room that smelled of kerosene and sweat, with no breaks except to eat, in a building where the baby in the next room had been coughing for 3 weeks. By the time a garment worker reached 30, the curvature of the spine was visible through a shirt. The eyes had been strained past recovery. The hands had begun to lose sensation in the fingers from the constant repetitive work. The body had been used as a production unit and was beginning to show the accounting of that use. New York, by 1890, produced more than half of all the clothing made in the United States. The garments in the department stores uptown on Broadway, the suits in the windows of Brooks Brothers, the dresses worn to the opera, they came from these rooms, from these backs, from these eyes. Now the economics. A family of 4 on the Lower East Side in 1890 might earn, combined, between $6 and $10 a week. Rent for a 2-room tenement apartment, 2 small rooms, no bath, shared toilet in the hallway or yard, ran between $6 and $10 a month. So the first week and a half of every month's earnings went to the landlord. The landlord, in most cases, lived in a different neighborhood entirely and sent a rent collector around on the first of the month. If you were 1 day late, the collector came back with a marshal. The pushcart markets were the lifeline. On Hester Street, on Orchard Street, on Essex, on Delancey, vendors set up every morning with whatever they had managed to acquire or produce. You could buy yesterday's bread for a penny, going stale but not yet molded. You could buy meat scraps, the trimmings from the butcher's block that hadn't sold, for a few cents. You could buy renovated butter, rancid butter that had been melted down and treated with baking soda to neutralize the smell, then re-chilled and resold. You could buy milk that had been extended with water and chalk dust to increase the volume and thin the fat. In summer, when there was no refrigeration and the heat in the tenements turned every room into an oven, the milk went bad fast. The street vendors knew this and charged accordingly. Slightly spoiled milk was cheaper than fresh. Mothers bought it anyway because it was what they could afford and fed it to infants, and the infants developed what the public health records called summer complaint diarrhea, dehydration. In the tenement districts in the 1890s, an infant who developed summer complaint in July had a meaningful chance of not surviving to September. Jacob Riis documented the infant mortality rate in these buildings as 1 death in 10. 1 in 10 children did not see their first birthday. Sleep was also an economy. If you had work and a small wage, you slept on the floor of a tenement room, 5 cents for a spot, sometimes sharing it with strangers, your coat under your head, your shoes tied to your wrists so they would not be taken in the night. If you had work and a slightly better wage, you shared a room with 2 or 3 other men and got a bunk or a plank bed. A private room, a room to yourself, was an aspiration that many people on the Lower East Side never achieved in their entire lives in America. If you had no work at all, you slept in a police station lodging house, where Riis photographed rows of men on bare wooden floors in a room designed for a fraction of the number it held. Or you slept outside, on the grates above the basement levels of buildings where warm air vented from below. The newsboys, boys as young as 8 or 10 who sold papers on street corners, were famous for sleeping on the grates above printing press basement vents on Park Row, where the warmth from the machinery below rose through the iron and could be felt through thin clothing in November. These children were not runaways. They were working. The newsboy system was semi-organized. Boys competed for corner territories, kept their earnings, and paid for their own food and lodging. Some had families somewhere in the tenements. Others had lost track of family or had none. What they had was a corner, a stack of papers in the morning, and whatever they earned from shouting headlines until the papers were gone. If they saved enough, they paid their 5 cents for a floor spot at night. If they didn't, the grate. Here's what disease looked like in this geography. Tuberculosis, called the White Plague, called consumption, thrived in darkness, in crowded rooms, in air that was not changed because there was nowhere for it to go. The bacteria were exhaled by infected individuals and drifted in the still air of windowless rooms and dark hallways for hours, sometimes days. Living in a tenement with an infected family member and not becoming infected yourself required a level of luck that most people did not have. On Cherry Street in Lower Manhattan, city health officials identified what they called the lung block, a block bounded by Cherry, Catherine, and Hamilton Streets, where tuberculosis had become so endemic that almost every family had at least one member coughing blood. The journalist Ernest Poole wrote about it in 1903, describing 1,000 families struggling on while many sank and polluted the others in air thickened with the living bacteria of what he called the Great White Plague. A tuberculosis diagnosis in 1890 was effectively a death sentence delivered on an indefinite timeline. There was no treatment. Sometimes there was rest, sunlight, fresh air, all of which were unavailable in the tenements. The standard medical advice was to move to the country or to a dry climate. That was the advice given to people who could not afford the rent on a 2-room apartment in a building with no windows. They stayed, they worked, they coughed. Across the blocks, the pattern repeated. A family would move in healthy, one member would come down with the cough, the rest would follow one by one over months or years, and the family would be replaced by another family who would begin the process again. The walls of the tenements were, in this sense, archives. They had absorbed the exhalations of everyone who had ever lived in them. The political system had a name. Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that had controlled New York City politics since the early 19th century, ran the city's patronage networks with a precision that was admirable if you were inside it and brutal if you were not. Want a job on the city payroll? Support Tammany's candidate. Want a pushcart license? Support Tammany's candidate. Want the police to leave your street vendor operation alone, or your boarding house, or your saloon? There was a man who collected a regular payment for that service, and that man reported to a district captain, who reported up a chain that ended at Tammany Hall. The immigrants of the Lower East Side understood the system quickly, because it was, in its structure, familiar. It was a patronage system, not unlike the systems in the countries they had come from. You paid tribute to whoever had power over your daily life. In exchange, you received a degree of protection. What you did not receive was anything that threatened the underlying arrangement. Better housing meant fewer people in fewer apartments, meant less rent revenue, means less money flowing through the system that kept Tammany in office. So better housing was always deferred. Reform was always just one more election cycle away. The tenements were not an accident of poverty. They were a business, and the business was working exactly as designed. On January 28, 1888, Jacob Riis walked into the first of what would become dozens of tenement rooms carrying a camera and something new, magnesium flash powder. The process was dangerous. You loaded the powder into a device and ignited it. There was a blinding white explosion of light lasting a fraction of a second, a large cloud of smoke, and an image captured on the plate inside the camera. Riis set tenement rooms on fire doing this. He burned off his own eyebrows more than once. He startled sleeping families at midnight, and they woke to white light and smoke and thought the building was burning. But the photographs were unlike anything that had been published before. In them, you could see the actual rooms, the actual bodies. A man with a curved spine bent over a machine at 2 in the morning. A family of 6 eating on a floor with no table. Rows of men on bare boards in a lodging house. Faces turned away from the flash, limbs folded at angles that suggested exhaustion rather than sleep. In 1889, Riis published his findings as a magazine article in Scribner's magazine. In 1890, the expanded version became a book, How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York. The title was a quotation from an older expression. Long ago, someone had noted that one half of the world did not know how the other half lived. Riis's answer was, because it did not look. Now it had to look. The book reached Theodore Roosevelt, who was then a member of the New York City Police Board. Roosevelt left his card at Riis's newspaper office with a note, "I have read your book and I have come to help." The two men would become collaborators. The relationship between them helped generate the political will that eventually produced the Tenement House Act of 1901, which mandated windows in every room, indoor bathrooms, improved fire escapes, and limits on how densely a building could be occupied. By 1901, an estimated 80,000 tenements had been built in New York. 3/4 of Manhattan's population lived in them. There is a building that is still standing on Orchard Street in Manhattan, number 97, built in 1863. For 72 years, more than 7,000 people passed through its apartments, most of them immigrants, most of them working the same calculations: wages versus rent versus food versus the cost of a doctor versus the cost of a burial. In 1935, the last tenants left. The building was used as storage. It sat mostly untouched for 50 years. In 1988, it became the Tenement Museum. You can walk through the apartments as they were. The rooms are small in a way that photographs do not fully communicate. The darkness in the interior rooms is real. There is no theatrical lighting, no reconstruction of the shadow. The rooms simply do not receive light because they were not built to receive light. They were built to hold as many bodies as could be fit within the legal definition of habitation. Standing in one of those rooms, it becomes difficult to hold two thoughts at the same time: that this is Manhattan, one of the wealthiest cities in human history, and that this is what the people who built that wealth lived inside. They are not contradictory thoughts. They are the same thought. The skyline that went up above the Lower East Side in the 1890s and the 1900s was built on the labor of people who could not see it from their apartments because their apartments had no windows facing the sky. The garments that dressed the city were sewn in rooms where the only light was a kerosene flame. The food that fed the city passed through the hands of peddlers who slept on floors for 5 cents a night. One half of the world did not know how the other half lived. The other half built the world the first half lived in. That is still the most important sentence Jacob Riis ever wrote. He did not write it as a conclusion. He wrote it as the beginning of a question that has not yet been fully answered. The tenements are mostly gone. The question is still there.